On a humid spring night in 1919, the editor of a New Orleans newspaper opened a letter that started with two words no one ever forgets once they've read them: esteemed mortal. The writer claimed he was not a man at all, but a fell demon from hottest hell. And he said the people of New Orleans could prove it to themselves on a specific Tuesday night. At 12:15 a.m., he promised, he would pass over the city and kill again, unless, inside your house, you were playing jazz. Any home without music, he wrote, could expect to meet the Axeman. That sounds like an urban legend, a creepy story someone made up years later to make a podcast sound better. But the letter is real. It ran in New Orleans papers in March 1919, and people took it seriously enough that when that night came, the city turned into one big, terrified concert. Dance halls stayed open past midnight. Families hired musicians or cranked up gramophones in cramped living rooms. On that one night, everyone agreed on the same superstition. Silence might get you killed. And the strangest part? No one died in an axe attack that night. To understand why a whole city believed a letter from hottest hell, you have to rewind about a year to a version of New Orleans that already knew how to live with ghosts. This was 1918, streetcars, gas lamps and jazz beginning to spill out of clubs and back rooms on warm nights. The air was thick with humidity and music and worry. The First World War was grinding to a close, the influenza pandemic was about to hit, and the city was its usual mix of wealth and poverty packed close together. Italians, Sicilians, Creoles, black families, immigrants, and old-line locals all lived in the same stew of narrow streets and corner groceries. In that world, the corner grocery was the center of gravity for a neighborhood, and a lot of them were run by Italian or Sicilian families who lived in the back rooms behind the shop. You'd buy bread from the same man you saw in church, whose kids played on the same sidewalks as yours. At night, when the shutters went up and lamps dimmed, those families slept just a thin wall or a single hallway away from the shelves and counters where they'd been weighing out sugar all day. For a stranger who wanted to break in, everything, home, business, bed, was in one compact place. The first attack that would later be pinned on the Axeman happened in the early hours of May 23, 1918, at the home of Joseph and Catherine Maggio. They were Italian grocers living above their shop at the corner of Upper Line and Magnolia. Sometime after midnight, someone slipped to the back of the building, removed a panel from the door with a chisel, and stepped into the quiet apartment where the Maggios were sleeping. The intruder carried two things, a straight razor and an axe that belonged to the family. The attack on the Maggios was brutal, even by later Axeman standards. Their throats were cut so deeply that Catherine's head was nearly severed, and then both were struck in the head with the axe as they lay in their bed. The killer didn't bother to ransack drawers or search for cash. Money and valuables were left in plain sight. Afterward, he changed out of his bloody clothes right there in the apartment, left them behind, and slipped back into the night. On the sidewalk outside, someone had scrawled a taunting message in chalk about Mrs. Maggio, just cryptic enough to make detectives wonder if the writer was trying to link himself to older, unsolved attacks on other Italian grocers. When Joseph's brothers came by in the morning, they found him barely alive. He died minutes later without giving anyone a usable description of the attacker. Police, doing what police do, looked first at the people closest to him. Joseph's brother Andrew owned the straight razor used in the attack, a barber's tool he'd recently taken home to get it honed, and he admitted he'd been drinking heavily that night. Detectives wondered how he could have failed to hear someone dismantling a door panel right next to his own rooms. For a few days, Andrew looked like the obvious suspect. Wrong place, wrong time, wrong razor. But his story held under questioning, and there was nothing to connect him to what happened beyond bad luck and his tool. At that point, Nobody was talking about the Axeman. In 1918, this was just a horrific double killing in a city that had seen its share of violence. New Orleans newspapers covered the story, people shook their heads and locked their doors for a while, and life went on. Then in the early hours of June 27, 1918, another Italian grocer and the woman staying with him were attacked in almost the same way. This time it was Louis Bassumer and his mistress, Harriet Lowe, sleeping in quarters at the back of his small grocery on the corner of D'Augenois and La Harpe. Just before dawn, a bakery wagon driver arrived for his normal delivery and found the shop strangely silent. When he went around back, he discovered Bassumer and Lowe in bed, both bleeding badly from blows to the head. The axe used on them, once again one of the victim's own tools, was found nearby. Miraculously, both were still alive. Bleeding and half-conscious, Bassumer told police he'd woken up to the feeling of being hit, not to the sound of anyone breaking in. There was no sign of forced entry beyond some disturbed doors and a dislodged panel, and once again, money and valuables were untouched. Harriet lingered for weeks before dying from her injuries, and in between surgeries, she changed her story more than once. At one point, she suggested that Bassumer himself was some kind of German spy, hinting at secret papers and hidden motives. It was 1918, America was at war with Germany, and that was all it took to send the papers and the police chasing a new angle. For a while, suspicion swung toward the surviving victim instead of the invisible attacker. He was arrested, questioned, and eventually released when nothing in his life matched the spy narrative beyond Harriet's fever dream accusations. The man with the axe stayed nameless and free. Between those two attacks, the patterns started to come into focus, at least for the cops and reporters paying attention. An intruder slipping in through a tampered back door. A family or couple attacked in their bed, almost always in the early hours before dawn. An axe taken from the victim's own property, used and then abandoned. Nothing truly valuable stolen. The targets were mostly Italian or Sicilian grocers and their households, small business owners living where they worked. You could read that as random or as something uglier, someone with a grudge against a community or someone who knew exactly how those homes were laid out. But because this was New Orleans, where rumor and hard fact have always lived side by side, people didn't just see a pattern, they saw a story forming. Some whispered about extortion and the old country mafia punishing grocers who didn't pay for protection. Others thought about a madman, someone with a split personality, a Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde figure who could be a decent neighbor by day and a ruthless killer by night. A retired Italian detective even said as much to the press, describing the attacker as a Jekyll-Hyde type who killed without rational motive. Summer in New Orleans is hot enough that people sleep with windows open, doors propped, clothes clinging to their skin. After the Bassumer attack, more families nailed their shutters tight, even if it meant suffocating in the heat. Night watchmen listened harder for small sounds. In Italian neighborhoods, shopkeepers who had once felt safe sleeping behind their counters began to imagine the shadow of a man standing over their beds. They didn't know his name yet, but they knew what he carried. The city wouldn't start calling him the Axeman until later, after more attacks gave the story momentum and a label. For now, he was just a shape in the dark behind the grocery, a hand on a back door panel, a weight lifting an axe that didn't belong to him. Somewhere in New Orleans, he was walking past people in daylight, on streetcars, in markets, in church, looking ordinary enough that no one turned away. It would take a few more blows, a few more families destroyed, and one very theatrical letter before the whole city realized it was living with a killer who was as interested in fear as he was in blood. By late summer 1918, New Orleans had started to connect the dots, even if nobody wanted to say the word cereal. The Maggio and Basuma attacks had already made Italian grocers nervous. People in those neighborhoods began sleeping a little lighter. Nails in the back doors, axes moved closer to the bed, just in case. Then in the early hours of August 5, 1918, the pattern jumped to a very different kind of victim. 28-year-old Anna Schneider, 8 months pregnant, asleep in her apartment with no grocery shop attached. She woke up to a figure looming over her and was smashed in the face again and again with what police later decided was a bedside lamp, not an axe. Her scalp was torn open, her hair matted with blood, but she somehow survived and gave birth to a healthy baby girl 2 days later. When her husband Ed came home after midnight and found Anna, the scene told a now familiar story with some unsettling twists. There were no signs of forced entry on the doors or windows, and nothing of real value seemed to be missing. Just a few dollars from Ed's wallet, the kind of half-hearted theft that felt more like staging than motive. Anna couldn't describe her attacker clearly. She remembered a shape, not a face, and then the blows. Police grabbed a local ex-convict named James Gleason who'd been seen acting suspicious nearby, but there was no physical evidence to tie him to the bedroom, and he was eventually released. Behind the scenes, investigators started quietly saying it out loud. This attack probably belonged in the same file as Maggio and Basuma. 5 days later, any hope that Schneider was a one-off collapsed. On August 10, 1918, an older barber named Joseph Romano was attacked in his home on the Tonti Street side of the city, where he lived with his 2 nieces, Pauline and Mary. In the night, someone got in, again by tampering with a door panel at the back, according to later write-ups, and smashed Romano in the head with an axe while he slept. The nieces rushed into the room and saw, just for a second, a large man in a dark suit and slouch hat moving away from the bed and heading out the door. Romano lived long enough to be taken to the hospital, but died 2 days later from his injuries. Outside the house, the same ugly details were waiting. A bloodied axe was found abandoned in the backyard, as if the attacker couldn't be bothered to take his own weapon home, or, more precisely, didn't need to, because once again it was believed to have come from the victim's own property. A panel on the back door had been chiseled away, leaving just enough room for a slim figure to reach in and unlock it from the inside. The home looked tossed, but nothing obvious was missing. Money, valuables, and Romano's barber tools were still there. Newspapers seized on the connections: Italian household, nighttime entry, sleeping victim, axe left behind, nothing stolen. If you'd been trying not to believe in a single axeman, the Romano murder made that denial a lot harder. For ordinary people in New Orleans, the Romano killing was the tipping point where the story stopped being those poor grocers and started being we have a monster in this city. Italian and Sicilian families, especially those running corner shops, felt like targets with bullseyes painted on their backs. Some neighbors whispered about anti-immigrant hatred, others about mafia extortion turning lethal. Police officials gave quotes to the press about a murderous degenerate who gloats over blood, language that did nothing to make people sleep easier. Night watchmen reported shadows that turned out to be nothing. Citizens flooded the station with calls about men loitering near alleys or carrying axes across yards in broad daylight, as if every handyman in town had suddenly become suspect. The detectives, for their part, were drowning in bad leads and half-truths. They arrested unlucky drifters, questioned suspicious boyfriends, and chased rumors of jealous business rivals and secret German spies left over from the war. Every time they thought they had someone, Basuma, Gleason, some nameless vagrant, the case fell apart under scrutiny, alibis, or lack of physical proof. The forensic tools of 1918 were fingerprints, footprints, and gut instinct. In crowded shotgun houses and corner stores where 100 people came and went every week, none of that stuck to one man in a dark suit. Meanwhile, the pattern kept pulsing under everything. Back doors chiseled, household axes turned into murder weapons, Italian surnames in the obituary column. By the end of that summer, the city had quietly given their ghost a name, the Axeman, even if the police reports stayed more cautious. You could hear it in the way people talked at barbershops and groceries. What if the Axeman comes here? What if he's watching us right now? Parents started pulling kids in earlier at night, and shopkeepers began reinforcing their doors in ways that would have looked paranoid a year earlier. Whatever else he was, the Axeman had discovered something that made him even more dangerous than his blade. He could change how a whole city behaved without saying a word. And in early 1919, he'd prove he knew that by finally opening his mouth. By early 1919, the city had settled into a weird rhythm with its fear. Months had passed since Joseph Romano's death, and while people still told Axeman stories in barbershops and groceries, the edge had dulled a little. Doors that had been double-bolted after the summer attacks started getting left on the latch again on hot nights. Some families told themselves the killer had moved on, hopped a train, found a new city to haunt. The pattern felt like it might be over, right up until it wasn't. Just after 3 a.m. on March 9th, 1919, the Axeman came back, this time across the river in Gretna, a working-class suburb of New Orleans. In a small house on the corner of Jefferson Avenue and 2nd Street, Italian grocer Charlie Cortimiglia, his wife Rosie, and their 2-year-old daughter Mary were asleep in the same bed. Neighbors later said the first thing they heard were screams, sharp enough to cut through the quiet streets. Grocer Orlando Giordano, who lived right across the way, ran toward the noise and found Rosie in the doorway, her head bleeding, clutching Mary's limp body in her arms. Behind them on the floor, Charlie lay semi-conscious in a widening pool of blood. Inside, the scene could have been copy-pasted from the New Orleans attacks. The family's axe was found on the back porch, smeared with blood. A wooden panel on the back door had been chiseled out, just large enough for a smaller person to reach through and unlock it from the inside. Money and valuables were still in the house. Nothing had been taken except Mary's life and whatever sense of safety the neighborhood had left. Charlie and Rosie were rushed to the hospital with skull fractures, both somehow still alive. Mary was pronounced dead, killed by a blow to the back of the neck, while her mother held her. At first, when doctors questioned them, neither parent could say who had done it. Head injuries, shock, and grief had scrambled everything. Charlie told police he didn't know who attacked them, only that he woke up in a nightmare. Rosie's story shifted as she drifted in and out of consciousness. Then, once she was more awake, she suddenly pointed the finger in a direction that shocked everyone. She said their neighbor, Orlando Giordano, and his teenage son, Frank, were the ones who'd come into the house with the axe. Overnight, the man who had run in to help became a suspect, and the Axeman, for a moment, turned from a faceless monster into a pair of familiar names. The accusations never really made sense on paper. Orlando was nearly 70 and in poor health, hardly the type to chisel his way into a house and overpower 3 people. Frank, on the other hand, was big, over 6 feet tall, more than 200 pounds, which created a different problem. The hole in the back door was so small that investigators doubted a man his size could have squeezed through it. Charlie vehemently denied his wife's story and insisted their neighbors were innocent. Still with a dead child, a terrified mother, and a city desperate for someone to blame, police arrested both Giordanos. A jury convicted them. Frank was sentenced to hang, Orlando to life in prison. Almost a year later, under less pressure and with time to think about what her words had done, Rosie recanted. She admitted she had lied about the Giordano's out of jealousy and anger tied to neighborhood business rivalries, and that she didn't truly know who swung the axe that night. The convictions were thrown out, and the men were eventually freed, but they never got back the months they spent labeled as child killers. The Cortimilia attack ended up doing two kinds of damage at once. It fed the Axeman's legend and showed how fast a community under stress will grab the nearest human target rather than sit with the idea of a stranger who can't be caught. In a way, the Axeman had managed to hurt people he'd never even touched. A few days after the Cortimiglia murder hit the papers, New Orleans woke up to something even stranger. A letter printed in the Times-Picayune, dated from Hell, March 13, 1919, and addressed to the esteemed mortal citizens of the city. The writer claimed to be the Axeman and mocked the police as fools who would never catch him, calling himself a demon and bragging that he could move through New Orleans unseen. Then he named a specific night and time, just after midnight, the following Tuesday, and promised that on that night he would pass over the city and kill again. There was one way out, he said. Any house or business where jazz was being played would be spared. Only the silent would get the axe. People argued immediately about whether the letter was real. Some thought it was a sick joke, a hoax written by a prankster, or a publicity stunt by some twisted jazz lover. Others were convinced it sounded exactly like the kind of theatrical taunting a killer who'd been reading his own press might enjoy. What mattered more than the author's identity was how precisely the threat hit New Orleans where it lived, religion and superstition on one side, music on the other. Even if you rolled your eyes at the idea of a fell demon from hottest hell, what if you were wrong? What if you chose silence and your house was the only dark, quiet one on your block? When that Tuesday night came, March 18, 1919, New Orleans decided not to risk it. Dance halls and cafes were packed shoulder to shoulder. Owners hired extra bands, figuring the cost was cheaper than a funeral. In neighborhoods that could never afford a live group, families cranked gramophones, banged on pianos, or invited a neighbor who could play a horn or a fiddle to come over and sit by the window. Jazz poured out of open doors and windows until the whole city sounded like one giant off-key orchestra playing for its life. People who might never have set foot in the same room under normal circumstances ended up swaying to the same beat, united by nothing more noble than mutual fear. Some time after midnight, the appointed hour slipped past. People held their breath, half expecting to hear sirens or screams cutting through the music. None came. No one was attacked with an axe that night. By dawn, the city had survived its strangest party, a night where the safest sound in New Orleans was loud, chaotic jazz. Whether the letter writer was really the Axeman, a clever troll, or someone trying to force the city to embrace its own music again, nobody could say for sure. What everyone agreed on was that the man with the axe, whoever he was, had just proven he could make an entire city dance on command, and he wasn't quite finished yet. For a little while after Jazz Night, New Orleans floated in a strange sort of relief. The letter's deadline had come and gone, the bands had packed up, and nobody had been hacked to death in their bed. Some people decided that proved the whole thing had been a hoax. Others believed, with the same intensity, that the Axeman had really passed over the city and found every house full of music, just like he'd demanded. Either way, the fear didn't disappear. It just slipped back under the surface, waiting for the next headline. That headline arrived on August 10, 1919, when another Italian grocer, Steve, or Etienne Bocca, was attacked in his home. Like so many others, he lived behind and above his little shop, the storefront just a thin wall away from his bed. Late that night, he woke to find a dark figure standing over him and was smashed in the head before he could fully register what he was seeing. He survived, but his memory of the attack was a fog of pain and panic. He stumbled out into the street bleeding, then collapsed. Investigators found the familiar signature behind him, a chiseled door panel, a missing axe taken from the property, and nothing truly valuable stolen. Less than a month later, on September 3rd, 1919, the axeman, if it was still the same man, went after someone who didn't fit his earlier pattern at all. 19-year-old Sarah Lillman, a single woman living alone in a small house. Neighbors, worried they hadn't seen her that day, broke in and found her on her bed with a serious head wound, her window smashed, and axe marks on the frame. A bloody axe lay in the yard, abandoned. Sarah survived, but, like Boker, could remember almost nothing about the attacker, just the feeling of being struck and then waking up in a hospital. Once again, no real robbery, no clear motive, and no one caught leaving the scene. The last killing, generally tied to the Axeman, unfolded in the early hours of October 27, 1919, at the home of Mike or Michelle, Pepitone. His wife woke to a chaotic scene, her husband staggering around the bedroom, his head and body torn open by blows, and a large, shadowy figure fleeing the room, disappearing down the hall and out into the night before she could get a good look. The walls and bed were splashed with blood. One account claimed the room looked like someone had flung paint. In the aftermath, police found the now familiar signs: blood, a missing hatchet or axe, and no real evidence of theft. Pepitone died from his injuries. The axeman, if that's who it was, seemed to vanish with him. After Pepitone's murder, the pattern abruptly stopped. No more late-night break-ins that looked quite the same, no more grocers or their families found bludgeoned beside a household axe. Theories sprang up to fill the vacuum. Some said the axeman had died, maybe in another city, maybe in some unrelated accident nobody connected to the murders. Others believed he'd been arrested for a different crime and disappeared into a prison cell under another name. A few clung to the idea that he'd simply grown bored and moved on, hopping a train to haunt some other place the way he'd haunted New Orleans. The police files stayed thick and unsatisfying, pages of interviews, suspects, and dead ends with no confession that stuck. One of the strangest theories focused on a man named Joseph Momfrey, an alleged small-time gangster with ties to Italian extortion rackets. In 1920, Pepitone's widow reportedly tracked Momfrey down in Los Angeles and shot him dead, claiming he had been responsible for her husband's murder. Later writers would spin that into a neat ending: the axeman, unmasked and executed by his last victim's wife. The problem is that the records are messy, and historians disagree on whether Momfrey was truly the same man behind all the axe attacks, or whether that story is more folklore than fact. Like most things in this case, the harder you push on it, the less solid it feels. There were other explanations too. Some Italian residents insisted the killings were connected to Black Hand-style extortion, punishing grocers who refused to pay protection money. Police and journalists floated the idea of a religious maniac, a Jekyll and Hyde personality who snapped at night. A federal investigator suggested a rail-riding serial killer who might have been responsible for similar family axe murders in other states. Each theory accounts for some details and leaves others hanging. None of them makes the jazz letter, with its theatrical flourish and oddly specific demand, feel completely explained. A century later, the axeman lives where New Orleans keeps many of its ghosts, in music, in stories, and in that strange space where true crime and legend overlap. Jazz bands still cover songs inspired by the letter, tour guides point out old grocery sites, and talk about the night the whole city played for its life. Somewhere behind the myth is a very real person who walked down real streets carrying a chisel, and who knew how Italian families in that era slept behind their shops. He killed at least 6 people, injured more, and was never definitively named in a court of law. What makes his story linger isn't just the violence, it's the control. A man who slips into houses and swings an axe is terrifying. A man who can also write a letter that makes an entire city fill the night with music, just in case he's telling the truth. That's something else. New Orleans will probably never know who he was or why he stopped. All it knows for sure is that for a year and a half, someone out there could choose a house at random, lift a tool from the yard, and change a family's fate between one heartbeat and the next. And that once, on a Tuesday in March, fear itself turned the whole city into his private orchestra. If you're still here with your headphones on, thank you for walking through those late-night streets in New Orleans with me, from the little corner groceries to that one insane night when a whole city turned itself into an orchestra out of fear. On paper, the Axeman is just a cluster of cases. Italian grocers, chiseled back doors, axes left behind, a few names in old police reports. But when you sit with it, it turns into something else. A pregnant woman waking up with her head split open, a mother clutching her dying child in a doorway, a man who can write one letter and make every gramophone in town spin at once. No mugshot, no real ending, just a trail of broken families and a demon voice in newsprint that might have been a man who liked the sound of his own myth. If this episode made you picture that back door panel being quietly pried away, or imagine what it felt like to stand in your living room on jazz night wondering if the music was loud enough to keep you alive, do me a favor and hit the like button so more people stumble into this story. And if you want more slow, cinematic horror history like this, unsolved murder sprees, haunted houses, unknown victims, and cases where the killer might still be just a name no one ever wrote down, make sure you subscribe so you don't miss whatever nightmare we dig up next. Now I want to hear from you. Who do you think the Axeman really was? A mob enforcer punishing grocers, a rail-riding serial killer, the jittery little crook, some people say Pepitoni's widow, shot in Los Angeles, or just a man who discovered he liked controlling a city more than he liked killing in it? Drop your theory in the comments. I'll be reading them in the dark, with imaginary jazz playing low in the background. And if you're using this to fall asleep, I hope the only tapping you hear tonight is rain on the window or a neighbor's music through the wall, not a chisel at your back door and footsteps crossing your kitchen floor.